She really, if you're talking about a Prime Minister with a big legacy, I think the two that really stand out are Attlee and Thatcher in her different ways. She was one of the most formidable leaders. The left loathed her, the right adored her.
Hi there, Niall Paterson, host of the Sky News Daily podcast here. Do hope you're well. It's been a pretty busy week on the Daily. We've been discussing everything from those hostages freed by Hamas to the religious communities here in the UK who are resisting a rise in hate crime. Now, if any of those appeal to you, you can click on the card that's appeared in the top right-hand corner of the screen to follow the podcast. This episode, however, we're focusing on a woman who, although she died 10 years ago now, still continues to cast a very long shadow over British politics. I am, of course, talking about Margaret Thatcher, who would have celebrated her 100th birthday this week. The Conservative Prime Minister from 1979 to 1990. To say she divides opinion is to put it mildly. For many of you, she probably feels like a distant past figure, but her influence is still very much felt in politics today, whether it's for her achievements, her role in ending the Cold War, for example, or the lowlights of her career, the miners' strike and the poll tax, springing to mind. So, who was Margaret Thatcher and what is her political legacy? Well, to find out, I sat down with our chief political correspondent and walking political encyclopedia, Jon Craig, who took us back to where it all began for Margaret Thatcher.
It began in Grantham in Lincolnshire. Her father was Alderman Alfred Roberts. He ran a corner shop and she was born above the shop. It was the 13th of October 1925. And, of course, she talked a lot about Grantham over the years. For example, she talked in her autobiography. She said, "I'd grown up in a household that was neither poor nor rich. We had to economise each day in order to enjoy the occasional luxury." And then she said, "My father's background as a grocer is sometimes cited as the basis for my economic philosophy." And of course, her economic philosophy was always never spend beyond your means.
Let's just continue with the rewind button. I mean, how did she become Prime Minister? I mean, a female Prime Minister at a time when female world leaders weren't exactly thick on the ground.
Well, she succeeded Ted Heath. She was MP. She became MP for Finchley up in North London, 1959. She was a front bencher under Heath. In the Heath government, she was Education Secretary. You may remember there was a slogan, "Thatcher the milk snatcher." She stopped free school milk. Now, after Heath lost twice, two general elections in 1974, some of the grandees stood, and it came down to a battle between Margaret Thatcher and Willie Whitelaw. Now, Willie Whitelaw was very much the establishment candidate. She was seen as the outsider. At the Tory conference last week, parallels were drawn between the circumstances between when Mrs Thatcher became leader and Kemi Badenoch coming after a heavy defeat. And of course, there were plenty of Tories who said, "Well, Margaret Thatcher struggled in the early years, just like Kemi is and is now." But she beat Willie Whitelaw, became leader February 1975. That was when Harold Wilson was Prime Minister. He quit in 76. Jim Callaghan became Prime Minister. Now, at the Tory conference last week, I heard a speech by the current chairman of the 1922 committee. That is Bob Blackman. He said that in the 70s, Margaret Thatcher was patronised, he said, not just by Labour Prime Ministers Wilson and Callaghan, but by the Tory establishment. They were terrible snobs, the Tories, in those days. Some people might say they still are, but they're not really. Nothing compared with the 1970s. So she was the outsider. She'd been to a grammar school. She'd gone to university, done chemistry and then law, and as I say, was elected to Parliament in 1959. She actually stood in Dartford twice in 1950 and 51. And you know how she met Dennis Thatcher? Dennis gave her a lift back to London in his Jag. And you know another parallel with Kemi Badenoch? That's how Kemi Badenoch met Hamish, her husband, because Hamish gave Kemi a lift back home in his car when she was the candidate against Tessa Jowell in Dulwich and West Norwood. So there are a few comparisons between Thatcher and Kemi, but not convinced that she's another Thatcher.
I mean, Margaret Thatcher was seen, in a way that Kemi Badenoch is not, as a strong and powerful leader. I mean, she became known as the Iron Lady, and she is still thought of in those terms by many within the party.
The Iron Lady was a term that the Russians gave her. So she became leader in 75, won an election in 1979. One of her great pledges, of course, was to tame the unions, and that was one of her great achievements, her supporters would say. But she struggled in that early period as Prime Minister too, 79 to 81. And she made a famous speech at the Tory conference 1980.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
Now, in 1981, she had a big reshuffle when she kicked out a lot of the old Tory toffs and brought in the likes of Norman Tebbit and Nigel Lawson into her cabinet. That was a cabinet really in her own making. And then, of course, the Falklands War changed everything. In 1982. That was the year I became a political correspondent. And the Falklands War began in around about Easter time. The Commons sat on Easter Saturday, went on till June. And of course, then she went on to win a massive majority in the 83 election, majority of 144, which at the time was seen as huge. But of course, Tony Blair and now Sir Keir Starmer have got bigger majorities than that. But yes, the Iron Lady, she was tough. She had a great ally in Ronald Reagan. And she and Reagan, of course, are credited with playing a key role in the collapse of the old Soviet Union, coming at the end of the Cold War, the bringing down of the Iron Curtain. So she had her fans, particularly in Eastern Europe. The Americans absolutely loved her. Her relationship with Ronald Reagan was brilliant. That made her a major figure on the international stage. She was a strong leader at home, but she was a big figure on the world stage too. She would absolutely strode like a colossus, if you like, at things like European summits. Remember those? There's a famous quote, which I absolutely love. François Mitterrand, the socialist French president, said she had the, let me get this right, the smile of Marilyn Monroe and the eyes of Caligula. I think I've got that right.
Well, let's talk about Europe just for a second then, John. I mean, look, the Conservatives over the course of my career covering politics have always had a complicated relationship with Europe, the EC and then the European Union. I mean, how much of that was down to Thatcher?
Well, it was pretty. It was much more cordial back then. I mean, she got on well with people like Mitterrand, Helmut Kohl, the German chancellor, and she had her European allies. It all really fell apart after she left at Downing Street in 1990. Now, I went to a fringe meeting at the Tory conference last week where Michael Heseltine was speaking. It was the European movement. Nobody's more pro-European than Michael Heseltine in the Tory party, with the possible exception of Kenneth Clarke. But Michael Heseltine said that Margaret Thatcher's greatest achievement was to help create the European single market. And he also went on to talk about how she was more practical than doctrinal. I mean, both abroad and in the UK, you talk to people who served with her in the 80s, in the run-up to that miners' strike in 84, 85. She waited. She didn't go to get into a battle with Arthur Scargill and the miners in the previous years, or Joe Gormley, Scargill's predecessor. She waited till the coal stocks were high, and she fought a canny battle, you could argue, with the miners and overcome Arthur Scargill. I mean, she called them the enemy within. But in terms of Europe as well, she had her successes. I mean, she did clash famously with a commission president called Jacques Delors. The Sun ran a famous headline, "Up yours, Delors." And also, I mean, towards the end of her time in Downing, I remember there was a big clash at a European summit, and towards the end, I remember a statement in the Commons when she said, "No, no, no." In terms of something that the Europeans were planning. She was very much against European integration, a federal Europe, but she was big, as Michael Heseltine said, big supporter of the single market. And there's been a lot of conjecture. Would she have supported Brexit? Now, her son, Mark Thatcher, Sir Mark, as he now is, gave an interview in the past week or so to commemorate her 100th anniversary, suggesting she would have backed Brexit. I'm not convinced she would have been a Brexiteer, and I certainly don't think she would have backed reform. I interviewed Mark Thatcher at the Thatcher dinner. He was being complimentary about Nigel Farage in our interview, but I'm not sure. I would have thought, knowing Margaret Thatcher, bear in mind she was the son of a Methodist lay preacher. She was okay. She liked. She used to flirt with men and so on, like people like Cecil Parkinson. There's been a suggestion in the last few days that she might have had an affair with her chief whip, Humphrey Atkins. No idea whether that's true. Not convinced. But she flirted. She loved Cecil. I think Margaret Thatcher would have regarded Nigel Farage as a rather vulgar character.
So she's one of the most significant politicians of the modern era, but inevitably it couldn't last forever, could it?
It all started to go a bit wrong for her late 1980s when some of, for example, there was Geoffrey Howe's resignation. Michael Heseltine, of course, had quit in 86. And, of course, there was the challenge to Margaret Thatcher. There was a stalking horse called Sir Anthony Mayer, who was an MP for Clwyd in North Wales, an obscure backbencher. He was even called the stalking donkey by some MPs. And then, of course, in 1990, Heseltine stood and there was a leadership contest. And, of course, John Major succeeded and not Michael Heseltine. Another famous quote, it was said at the time, he who wields the dagger never wears the crown. And that's very true in politics.
You speak, though, to members of the Blue Rosette Brigade, and they often say, Margaret Thatcher, she was made of different stuff. She was cut from different cloth, and perhaps we saw that during the Falklands. But I think we can say with certainty that we saw that steadfastness when there was, of course, the attack on the Conservative Party conference in Brighton.
I was about to mention that, the Brighton bomb in 1984. That bomb went off at 10-3 on the last night of the conference, the Grand Hotel, the famous Grand Hotel in Brighton. Enormous bomb. It had been planted by IRA weeks before, and it made not only huge damage, but there were Margaret Tebbit, Norman Tebbitt's wife, was left paralysed for the rest of her life. Norman Tebbit never forgave the IRA because it changed his life completely. And the Brighton bomb, I remember the rescue in the morning was carried on breakfast TV. It was before Sky News in those days. Sky News was launched in 1989. Norman Tebbit was pulled out in his pyjamas, and Margaret Thatcher went up to Jon Craig, who was the veteran political editor of the BBC at the time, lovely man, Northern Irishman, and said, "John, the conference goes on, the conference goes on." And they were back in that hall at 9:30 or whatever it was in the morning. She wasn't going to let the IRA disrupt the Conservative Party conference. And that showed great courage. And that was an attempt to kill her and Dennis and half the cabinet.
So what else will she be remembered for? I mean, what is her legacy today?
I mentioned the miners' strike, also big privatisation of industries, taming the trade unions. A lot of the industries we talk about now, I mean, Thames Water, that was privatised by Michael Howard in 1989. British Airways, all these industries were privatised. The other big achievement, her supporters would say, council house sales, enabling lots of people who had been tenants to buy their own homes. A real great long list of her achievements. But in the end, she became too dogmatic. She fell out with the likes of Geoffrey Howe and some other ministers. And of course, Tories were worried they were going to lose the 1992 election if she'd stayed on. John Major became Prime Minister. He won in April 1992, majority of 21. But of course, she's still absolutely revered, loved and adored by many Tories, both young and old. She really, if you're talking about a Prime Minister with a big legacy, I think the two that really stand out are Attlee and Thatcher in her different ways.
I've lost count over the years that I've been doing this job of the number of Conservative politicians who've tried to style themselves as the heir to Thatcher.
Yes, but there hasn't really been a party leader, has there, that's like Margaret Thatcher. If you think back, the leaders have been completely different in character. Margaret Thatcher, I guess, really, you'd say was a one-off. She always talked about sound money. I mean, that was one of the reasons I think why she would have no truck with Nigel Farage, because he's spraying promises about spending all over the place at the moment, whereas at least Kemi Badenoch is trying to say we're not going to spend money we can't afford. So she's trying to follow the Thatcherite way, but she's no Margaret Thatcher, really.
What do you think she'd make? What do you think Thatcher would make of the Conservatives under Kemi Badenoch?
Well, I think she'd be loyal, as some of the old guard like Heseltine are. because they desperately need to be. I mean, what would she say about leaving the European Convention on Human Rights and those sort of policies? Because, of course, Tories are very much divided on that, aren't they? Because they say, well, Winston brought those helped frame those policies. Now, the argument used, of course, is that they're now out of date. She was a pragmatist. She didn't fight a battle that she thought she couldn't win, whether it was the miners or Argentina, Gualtieri and the Falklands. And she did have some spectacular successes. I mean, I think back some of the legislation she put through on privatisation. Some of that really struggled, and she battled through. She was formidable at the dispatch box.
But was that the full story, though, John? I mean, this image, this stereotype that we have of her as ramrod straight, absolutely tough as nails, the Iron Lady, all the rest of it. I mean, there are reports that she was anxious before her meetings with the Queen, for example.
We just had the case for the defence, haven't we? Let's have the case for the prosecution. You go to many northern communities, they still are very bitter about the miners' strike. They claim that, of course, unemployment got very high. I think it got to 3 million at one point. And, of course, there are plenty of enemies of Margaret Thatcher, particularly on the left, in the trade unions, who say that her policies were brutal, that she destroyed many communities, particularly mining communities, steel communities, for example. There was a big strike by the steel workers in the early 80s as well. And, of course, so there are many industries that critics will say she let decline, like shipbuilding is one that declined under her time as Prime Minister as well, Thatcherism. And, of course, there are those also who claim that privatisation has been bad for many of those industries. For example, I mean, look at the water industry now. I mean, that you could argue that was an industry should never have been privatised. There, yes, she had her critics, plenty of those, particularly on the Labour left, and in what you might call working class communities, mining communities, and so on. The loathing of Margaret Thatcher is still there.
True. But isn't it worth remembering that actually in Margaret Thatcher's wake, the Conservatives had another two female prime ministers.
Correct.
And in fact, right now, Kemi Badenoch's in charge, which is the fourth female leader that the Conservatives had. By way of comparison, Labour's not looking desperately progressive.
Well, Labour has had good, formidable women over the years. One thinks back of Barbara Castle in the Harold Wilson cabinet, and one or two others. I mean, Margaret Beckett was deputy leader at one point. But, the Tory record is much better than Labour's. I mean, of course, they will also say we had the first leader, Prime Minister from an Asian background. So, yes, in many ways, the Tories are much more enlightened than the Labour Party. I mean, I think it's frankly astonishing that Labour have still not had a woman leader. Here we are in 2025. I mean, until a few weeks ago, you might have thought Angela Rayner might at one point become the next Labour leader, but we'll see. I do think Angela Rayner will be back at some point.
You're certainly going to keep your fingers crossed that within the next 100 years, Labour might have a female leader. We are talking, though, John, 100 years on from Thatcher's birth, about her legacy. I'm going to put my neck out here and say, in 100 years' time, people will still be talking about Margaret Thatcher and her legacy.
Probably, yes. I mean, people still talk about Disraeli and Gladstone and Lloyd George and various other prime ministers, don't they? I mean, I dare say it'll be it'll be a subject of, it'll be studied by history students because she was one of the most formidable leaders. A controversial leader, as we've said, who divided opinion. The left loathed her, the right adored her. The Tory conference, images of Thatcher were everywhere. They love her, they adore her. And the number of events, dinners and seminars and talks and so on and exhibitions at the moment, shows that people still are fascinated by her 100 years after she was born. She's regarded by Tories as a successful Prime Minister, and every Prime Minister, I suppose, or every leader of the party in the years to come will want to be like Margaret Thatcher and achieve some of the electoral success that she did, and also shape the future of the country in the way that she did. She transformed the country.
Thanks very much to John and, of course, to you for listening. If you want to see more videos from the Sky News Daily podcast team, you can click on the playlist that's appeared over on the right. If you want to see more videos from Sky News, just click the channel button in the middle.